Attorney General Pam Bondi is facing some criticism over her recent comments about hate speech. Here's what she said on the Katie Miller podcast yesterday.
There's free speech and then there's hate speech. And there is no place, especially now, especially after what happened to Charlie in our society. We will absolutely target you, go after you if you are targeting anyone with hate speech, anything. And that's across the aisle.
While hate speech can be offensive, it is generally protected by the First Amendment, and a number of conservatives were quick to call Bondi out on that.
Yeah, today the Attorney General seemed to clarify her remarks, writing, quote, hate speech that crosses the line into threats of violence is not protected by the First Amendment. This morning, President Trump was asked about Bondi's remarks. Listen to this.
What do you make Pam Bondi saying she's going to go after hate speech? Is that, I mean, a lot of your allies say hate speech is free speech.
She'll probably go after people like you because you treat me so unfairly. It's hate. You have a lot of hate in your heart. Maybe they'll come after ABC. Well, ABC paid me $16 million recently for a form of hate speech, right? Your company paid me $16 million for a form of hate speech. So maybe they'll have to go after you.
Let's talk about this with CNN senior political analyst Ron Brownstein, an opinion columnist for Bloomberg, and Jeff Angelo, a conservative radio host. Thank you both for being with us. Jeff, first to you, what do you make of Bondi's attempt to clarify what she, I guess, meant to say regarding hate speech, that it's not just speech, but it's speech that crosses into threats of violence? Do you agree?
I think that if you're threatening violence, obviously that's something that our law enforcement officials can investigate, but that is a concept that I think we all agree to. I don't think that's hate speech. In fact, it's really disturbing to hear a Republican administration start to talk about hate speech, because for many, many years, conservatives derided the concept of hate speech. They thought that was an avenue for the government to go after speech that it didn't like. So it's very discouraging, I think, to conservatives like me to hear the administration start to adopt terminology like hate speech and say we'll go after it. And certainly I think it's conservatives that started to rein Pam Bondi back in, and why she had to clarify today that they're looking into investigation of threats of violence. That's a whole different concept than hate speech.
Yeah, incitement, violence, that's a different category. Ron, how are you seeing this disagreement within the Republican Party?
You know, I think it is a reflection of the larger truth that in many ways, the fundamental impulse of the second Trump administration is not so much conservative as it is quasi-authoritarian. I mean, it's not really about taking ownership positions in companies, censoring speech. These are not positions that conservatives have traditionally espoused, but it is consistent with a view of accumulating as much power in the executive over all elements of society and weakening the ability of those opposed to him to resist him. So I actually think her first impulse, as is all, people describe a gaffe in Washington is when you say what you really mean. I think that her first answer was actually a more reflective of kind of the underlying compass of this administration.
I think the first thing people say, not always, but sometimes you do get that impression. Jeff, I wonder what you think of that, especially considering the president filed a $15 billion defamation lawsuit against the New York Times last night. This morning, you heard what he said to Jonathan Karl of ABC News, saying maybe they'll go after you in response to this question about Bondi's assertion on hate speech. What do you think?
I think that often the president takes things very personally, and therefore, if you've crossed him, if you say something negative about him, he gets very angry and in your face about that. I do agree that if this is actually going to be followed up on principle, then conservatives ought to call the president and the administration out on that. I think there are a lot of things that this administration's doing that conservatives support, but obviously it's a violation of longtime principle if you're going to go after your political opponents. This is something that we conservatives definitely derided during the Obama administration. We thought his administration was going after conservative groups. So it's now not the time to say, well, we're going to retaliate by doing the thing that we said we hated in the first place. It's time to stick to your first principles and say, this is not something that the government ought to be doing.
Ron, Pennsylvania Democratic Governor Josh Shapiro held an event today and sort of talked about the state of discourse in the United States. Let's listen.
All forms of political violence and making clear it is all wrong. That shouldn't be hard to do. Unfortunately, some, from the dark corners of the internet all the way to the Oval Office, want to cherry pick which instances of political violence they want to condemn. Listen, doing that only further divides us.
Do you think messages of unity and sort of positivity like that are breaking through right now, Ron?
I think ultimately most Americans, Boris, don't want to live this way. They don't want to live at this elevated level of hostility in kind of camps, hostilely arrayed camps against each other with this increasing reality of political violence from both ends of the political spectrum. Most Americans don't want to live that way. Now, can you be heard with a message that kind of calls on all of us to kind of step back from the battlements? It's hard in this climate because, as Josh Shapiro talked about, and I watched that appearance, often it is the most divisive messages that get amplified the loudest. And the person with the loudest megaphone is the president. And you can't overstate how profoundly President Trump is departing from what we have seen from other national leaders at moments of like this in the past. Moments of this kind of tension and tragedy is when presidents have tried hardest to speak to and for the entire country. He's not doing that. He is governing at this moment as the leader of a faction, not the leader of a nation. And that does add to the strains that we are facing.
Jeff, what did you think about what you heard Governor Shapiro say there?
Well, I think that the answer is much bigger than what our politicians are saying. This morning it was ironic that there was a suspect that made an appearance in court who shot and killed the CEO of a healthcare company. By the way, that CEO is from a little town called Jewell, Iowa. I think as a society, we're continuing to rationalize that it is okay to commit violence against people with whom we disagree. I think that when I immerse myself in social media as a talk show host, and there's a lot of social media these days beyond what politicians are talking about that say, oh, I really owned my opponent, or watch this person get humiliated, or watch this person stunned into silence by his opponents. And we're getting a lot of emotional satisfaction by people getting what's coming to them. I think that's a real sickness in our society in general, and I think it's beyond what politicians are talking about. I think ultimately we as a culture have to say we're not deriving any emotional satisfaction from people getting what they deserve. I do agree with Ron. I think this is really exhausting for all of us to have to go through this outrage every single day. And I hope people of goodwill will rise up and say, look, we can't live this way continuously.
We certainly hope so. Jeff Angelo, Ron Brownstein, appreciate you both. Thanks for sharing your perspectives.